Commander manabases are one of, if not the most overlooked aspects of building a commander deck. Many times, players cut too many cards from this part of the deck, leaving themselves unable to play consistent games. In this section of our guide to the commander format, we are going to explore what you should be considering for your commander's mana base. Do note, this is merely a guide to what you should be looking for when building your own. It's not the end-all, be-all. But with that in mind, let's begin. So the point of a well-built mana base is to maintain and support your tempo as the game progresses and you develop your board state. You want to be able to play spells each turn and hit your land drops as often as possible during the opening turns. Having a mana base that works well will let you hit those land drops every turn and ensure that you have access to all of the colors of your deck. We're going to begin with mana rocks, which I will include in this video because they are crucial to the land section of your deck. Mana rocks are artifacts that can tap for a quantity of mana. Soul Ring, for example, is a 1-drop artifact that taps for 2 colorless mana, and this is widely regarded as the best mana rock in Commander, because it can come down as early as turn 1 and immediately be tapped for mana. I cannot think of a single Commander deck that doesn't want to run this card, and it is ubiquitous to the format. From there, we have our 2-drop artifacts that can tap for mana. These have largely become the gold standard for mana rocks, largely in part due to the printing of the card Arcane Signet. This 2-drop can tap for any color in your commander's color identity, and aside from the true colorless decks, this can be helpful in any deck. The 2-drop slot is also home to 3 very important cycles of mana rocks that are extremely playable in Commander and are cards you should consider. The first of these is the Medallions. There is one for each of the 5 colors, and while they don't themselves tap for mana, they make spells of their respective colors cost 1 generic mana less to cast. This does not reduce the colored mana requirements for those spells, but it does provide a consistent discount on mana, making them excellent add-ins for 1 and 2 colored decks. For decks with 3 or more colors, these may become less impactful as you begin to have too many spells with other colors that will not get this discount. A cycle of rocks relevant to those more color-hungry spells is the Talisman cycle. These are among my favorite of the cycles we will discuss here. They are each 2 mana for an artifact that can tap for either a colorless mana or one of 2 specific colors, and then you lose 1 life in using this ability. These are extremely flexible, as they can tap for the colorless mana when you don't need the colored mana, or they can tap for either of the 2 colors when you do. If you are in a 2 or 3 color deck, these should be on your radar to include, as they will help fix your mana in the early turns. Some 4 color strategies can certainly use these as well, and in some cases even 5 color decks can use these. The final 2-drop cycle is the Signets. Again, we have 10 of these, 1 for each of the 2 color pairs, that come in for 2 mana. You then have to pay 1 mana of any color to tap these, and then they produce 1 mana each of their 2 colors. So you get 2 mana. These are very helpful to filter your mana, as there are times in 2 and 3 color decks that you lack access to one of your colors, and this can help you filter what you have into the colors you need. I also recommend these be included in 2 color decks and even some 3 color decks, but 4 and 5 color decks might find them a little bit too restrictive in their color production to be included. Depending on your deck, however, they may find a home in those decks. Mind Stone is another 2-drop artifact that can tap for 1 colorless mana. This one introduces additional utility, as you can pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice the Mind Stone to draw a card. This is something we will discuss later on in this video, as having utility like this makes a card much more useful. At some point in the game, the value gained by tapping the Mind Stone for mana might become less relevant, and so having the ability to trade it in for a card can give a card a nice final hurrah with some late game value. From here, we go to 3-drop artifacts. This is something of difficult territory, as in the past, the 3-drop slots were home to cards like Darksteel Ingot and Chromatic Lantern, and were more widely used. Because of cards like Mind Stone, the Talisman cycle, and Arcane Signet becoming more widely available and popular in recent years, the 3-drop slot has largely become unnecessary for mana rocks. 3-drop slots are not something you really want to use in most cases, though they are extremely easy to find, and if you're on a budget, maybe you include some. I think the one exception to this rule would be Chromatic Lantern, and only if you're unable to access some of the more expensive lands that we will be discussing shortly. The reason being is that while the Chromatic Lantern taps itself for 1 mana in any color, it also gives your lands this ability as well. Mana fixing is something of great value in Commander, and if you can turn your lands into rainbow lands, you will have a much easier time casting your spells. There are other cards in the game that exist that fill a similar function, but the Chromatic Lantern is the only one that is a colorless artifact and therefore universally splashable. A word of note before we move on to the land part of this discussion. There exist some cards that are considered as powerful, if not more so, than Sol Ring. Cards like Mana Crypt, Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, Mana Vault, Grim Monolith, just to name a few. These are not cards I recommend you play, if only because of their price. Many have not gotten a reprint in many years, some are on the reserve list and therefore will not be getting a reprint, and as a result, some of them are extremely expensive. If you are not playing in the competitive end of the format, called CEDH, I do not recommend you even consider these cards. They are too expensive and, quite frankly, unnecessary for your Commander deck's needs. Now for our next section, we will be discussing the land cards that you should consider. Lands are perhaps the most neglected part of your deck building process. You generally will want between 36 and 40 lands in your deck. Some decks, because of their function or their mana curve, can work better with 36 lands or even fewer, but largely those decks have either few spells that cost a lot of mana, or they have other methods of producing mana. Some decks have higher curves and will need more lands in play, and so you'll want to play closer to the 40. You will want to look at how much mana your spells will actually require to cast and ensure that you have the mana resources in play to cast them. Yes, Enter the Infinite is a very fun spell to resolve, but having 12 mana in play, let alone 4 of them requiring to be blue, is extremely tricky to pull off. We have two major categories to our lands, utility and simple. Simple lands are what I consider lands that only tap for mana, and it could be something like a basic land that only taps for a single color of mana, or it can be a dual or rainbow land that can tap for any number of other colors. Basic lands are what I would say to add last when building your mana base. If you are in anything other than a single color commander deck, you will want to include many more lands that will give you access to multiple colors, and so having a high number of basics might slog you down. Command Tower is perhaps the one card that any commander deck would want to start off the mana base with. It comes in untapped and immediately will tap for any color in your commander's color identity. If you aren't playing a mono-colored deck, you will want to include this in your list. But beyond that, we have a number of cycles of lands that you can explore when putting together your commander's mana base. Perhaps the best dual land you can consider for your commander deck are the cycle of what is called the Shock Land. These are non-basic lands that contain the basic land types, and so a card like 3 Wishes, one of many land tutors that doesn't specify a basic land, can search for one of these as long as it has the forest type on it, like Overgrown Tomb. A card like Cultivate cannot search for Overgrown Tomb because it specifies a basic land. These shock lands, though, are able to enter the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2 life. In Commander, we begin games with 40 life, and so 2 life is a very small price to pay to have a land enter untapped. These can then be tapped for their mana and used right away. In multicolor decks, I would say having as many shock lands that are available to your colors is the best way to start building your mana base, as these are the best dual lands you can run. A quick note, there exists an older cycle of dual lands called the original dual lands, which are largely the same as the shock lands, except they do not have any requirements to enter play untapped. They do not have that shock clause. They are very expensive, and again, you do not need these if you are playing anything other than competitive Commander. The money that you would end up spending on just one of these, you would be able to buy an entire Commander deck with the mana base. Moving on, we have a few other cycles of lands that I would recommend. A cycle of lands referred to as the Pain lands are another great option. These come in untapped, and while they do lack the basic land types the shock lands have, they function largely the same as the Talisman cycle. They can tap for a colorless mana, or they can tap for one of 2 colors at the cost of dealing 1 damage to you. These are excellent to fix your mana, and as you'll see going forward, I place a high value on dual lands that enter play untapped. These are generally more affordable than the shock lands, and while they aren't searchable by most means, they do offer tremendous value in their ability to fix your mana. I would run these in just about any multicolor deck. Next, we have a cycle of lands called the Battle Bond lands, as they were originally introduced in the Battle Bond set. These also do not have basic land types, but they enter the battlefield untapped as long as you have 2 or more opponents. Since Commander games usually have 4 players, these will almost always enter the battlefield untapped. They tap for 1 mana of 2 specific colors, and they have no other downsides, making them excellent early turn plays. These are great in any multicolor commander deck. Check lands are another cycle I tend to favor, though this is where we get to see some special conditions needed to have lands enter play untapped. These are generally more accessible, but these lands enter play untapped as long as you control at least 1 land of either 2 land types. These are only looking for the basic land types, so if you have a shock land in play or something similar, it will still count. And so while these can occasionally whiff and enter play tapped, they are still extremely valuable in 2 and 3 colored decks where you'll likely be able to get those requirements. Once you begin adding in a 4th or 5th color, these become more likely to enter the battlefield untapped, and you may want to invest in other lands. Snarls are the next cycle, though not all of the lands in this cycle contain the word snarl in their naming, and we again have a conditional to them entering play untapped. You have to reveal a card with either of the 2 specified land types from your hand to have it enter the battlefield untapped. These are great budget options, as many of them have been printed recently enough at the time of recording that they are still largely affordable. The next cycle of lands isn't so much a cycle as it is a separate category of lands called Rainbow Lands. These are lands that have the ability to tap for any color, though some have conditionals to that ability. Cards like Mana Confluence and City of Brass will cost you 1 life to use them. Exotic Orchard can produce mana based on what lands your opponents have in play. Forbidden Orchard gives an opponent a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token when it's tapped. Ancient Ziggurat's mana can only be used to cast a creature spell. Cavern of Souls can only cast creature spells of a chosen creature type, but that spell cannot be countered. These lands all range in price, though many are affordable. If a card is too expensive for your budget, you do not have any need to break your bank for the sake of a single card. However, many cards we've discussed are still excellent additions to supplement your mana base if you are in need of additional lands. The last cycle of mana producing lands that I feel I see the least are the lair lands. These are an older cycle and have 1 condition to them entering the battlefield. You must return a non-lair land you control to its owner's hand. These each tap for 1 of 3 colors and are extremely useful in 3 and 4 color decks. I really don't recommend them in 5 color decks, but I've been using them for years in my 3 color builds to great success. They are similar to the Ravnica Karus, another series of dual lands that do have to enter the battlefield tapped, but they also require you to return a land you control to its owner's hand. These are good budget lands and ensure that you get a land drop next turn, though some decks might not be keen on them having to enter the battlefield tapped. Now, of course, there are many other cycles of dual lands out there. Some have the basic land types, some do not. The ones that we've discussed here are largely what I go to when building decks. They give me my colors. They are more than often not the ones that enter the battlefield untapped. If you are playing on a budget or don't have access to these cards, there are many other options available to you, and they're all valid choices. The last cycle of lands to consider are fetch lands. These have many cycles of these. The most popular ones are from Onslaught and Zendikar, although these specific ones have been reprinted several times since. These lands do not tap for any mana on their own. Instead, they can be tapped, sacrificed, and with the additional cost of 1 life paid, you can search for a land containing either of 2 specific land types to enter the battlefield untapped. These are considered the top tier of fetch land, and I generally will include at least the ones that are within the commander's color identity. One stipulation about these is that while they do specify 2 basic land types, they do not have themselves a color identity. So even if you are playing in a deck that's only green and black, you could run Polluted Delta to help you fetch a swamp card, even though the Delta mentions islands. It is not considered a blue card by any means. This tier of fetch land is generally a little pricey, though they have been seeing regular reprints every now and then. There are many other fetch land cycles, though budget options such as Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds do exist, and cycles similar to those, such as the Alara Panoramas and the Capenna fetches, which do specify basic lands, and so if you're working on a more of a restrictive budget, there are plenty of excellent options. This brings us to our final section, utility lands. These are lands that do not always tap for mana, but oftentimes have an ability on them that can be relevant to what our deck wants. Cards like Reliquary Tower give us a valuable ability that is tacked onto a land, making them incredibly useful and pretty resilient. My advice for including these though is the more colors that you have in your deck, the less utility lands that you should consider slotting in. If you have 4 or 5 colors in your commander deck, you should minimize how many lands that you include that do not tap for colored mana, as it can hinder your ability to play your cards if you can't access the proper mana. 5-color commander decks are very picky for mana, and without proper access to your colors, you will find yourself stuck. In 1 and 2 color decks, and even 3 colors, you'll find it easier to get your colors online, and so you can devote a few more slots in your mana base to utility lands. Now, if you've bought a commander precon deck, the mana base for these is generally a good start. If you've begun upgrading your commander precon deck, your focus should be to learn on what the deck wants to do, and so your first upgrade should be to your spell book. The mana base can be upgraded later on to include more of the cards that we've discussed here. Lastly, when you're at the end of adding your dual lands and all of your utility lands, I would take a look at your deck and separate the spells into piles of each color. You want to see how many pips are there for each of your colors and determine what your most represented color is, then your next most represented, and so on. This will help you determine how many basic lands you need for each color. From there, you fill out the remainder of your mana base with basics. Making sure you have enough lands and mana sources is a key factor in making sure your deck works. If you have a deck that can handle 36 lands, make sure you have a good enough mana base to justify that, and vice versa. Cutting a land here or there to add a pet card or a card you want to run is a very common mistake commander players make, and can lead to poor performance in game. So I want you to be prepared before you're in trouble. With that, we will wrap up our discussion on mana bases. Do remember, this is only a guide based on my experience and is not the end all for building a mana base. If you have a method that works well for you, feel free to let others know in the comments section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, likes and shares are the best way to help support the channel. If you're new here, remember to subscribe, and as always, I'll catch you all next time.